Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Banned Book Week kickoff, North County San Diego chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority in conjunction with the NAACP North County. We are so pleased to bring this movement to you and open this discussion in our area. We have some fantastic panelists and a host of other dynamic individuals that will contribute to this conversation, a load of information. We'd like to start off with greetings and introduction from Mrs. Karen Bickham. Take it over, Mrs. Bickham.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you terribly for joining North San Diego County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated Banned Books Week. This is our opening ceremony of the webinar. I am Karen Bickham, the president of North San Diego County Alumni Chapter, and it's indeed a pleasure to honor you and to present and sponsor this week of events to educate and engage the public for the Banned Books Week 2023, The Freedom to Read. North San Diego County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was chartered on April the 20th, 2013 by 24 dynamic, driven, and committed women, true to Delta's core of college-educated women, predominantly Black, committed to sisterhood, scholarship, service, and social action. We were eager to make a difference and serve the North San Diego County communities, and we immediately formed partnerships with other organizations of service in the community, like the San Diego Habitat for Humanity, North San Diego County Lifeline, the Active Duty and Veteran Military Association, the North San Diego County NAACP, and True Care, and these are but a few that I'd like to name. We are over 1,000 Delta Sigma Theta sorority chapters with over 300,000 members doing the work of Delta Sigma Theta throughout the world, focusing on our Delta's 5-point programmatic trust, economic development, educational development, international awareness and involvement, physical and mental health, social action, political awareness and involvement. So as a not-for-profit public service organization, we are thrilled to sponsor the Banned Book Week of events. Today's webinar is the first. We ask you to follow the North San Diego County Alumni Chapter Banned Book Week schedule of events and to join us for other events, especially for our October 5th book club, which will be via Zoom, and October 7th ticketed brunch and thank you, Kamilah, brunch and panel discussion event. At this time, I want to acknowledge and thank our phenomenal Social Action Chair, Renee Tarver, for initiating and organizing the North San Diego County Alumni Chapters Banned Book Week series of events. I want to thank all of you sincerely for joining us today, and especially our esteemed guest. And you will be introduced. I'm going to allow Soror Kamilah Brown to do the formal introduction of all our guests. So thank you very, very much and enjoy.
Greetings again. My name is Kamilah Brown. I am a member of the North County San Diego chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Inc. I'm also a 17-year educator I'm an administrator at a local middle and high school and a servant of the community, and I am pleased to be your moderator for this event. We have three, actually more than three, distinguished guests, and I would like to introduce you to them. First, we have Joyce McIntosh. She is the Assistant Program Director for the Freedom to Read Foundation to First Communication and the First Amendment for 3 decades. Her background in education and journalism and library and information science have led her work to work for newspapers, nonprofits, and for the last 2 decades in libraries. She's worked in a public library outside of Chicago, Illinois, providing reference, programming, outreach, and assistive technology before joining the foundation. With the foundation and the American Library Association, her work has focused on education about the First Amendment and censorship, and helping libraries navigate challenges in their school and public libraries. Please welcome her. We also have Leah Watson. She is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, Racial Justice Program, where she focuses on classroom censorship efforts, education gag orders is what they're called, bias in policing, and criminalization of poverty and racial disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Previously, she was the senior counsel in the Criminal Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she led litigation challenging debtors, prisons, and executive fines and fee practices in Arkansas and Oklahoma. Leah co-authored reports, delivered community trainings, and developed policy recommendations for fines and fees reform at the state and local levels. She launched Project, that's an acronym, Protect, that's an acronym, a guide for law enforcement engagement with students of color. Prior to joining the Lawyers Committee, Leah was a senior associate at Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher LLP and an associate at Baker Hostetler LLP. She led cross-border investigations in one of the top 10 largest Foreign Corrupt Practices Act settlements. She was a member of the trial team that secured a victory in the largest residential mortgage-backed securities trial in history. Leah obtained special immigrant juvenile status and custody orders for pro bono clients and successfully challenged a pro bono client's criminal conviction. During a 6-month externship at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, she represented clients in disability rights, police misconduct, fair housing, and wage theft cases. Leah earned her JD from Harvard Law School. Prior to law school, she taught high school in Atlanta through Teach for America. She earned her BA magna cum laude in communication studies and sociology from Vanderbilt University. We have some heavy hitters, you all. I'm here to tell you, I'm excited about this conversation. And last, but certainly not least, Elizabeth Leiba is a writer, a college professor, and an advocate for Black business women. She's also my soror. She has over 130,000 followers on LinkedIn who range in age, race, background, location, and primarily located in the US, Canada, and the UK. Her passion for Black history changed her life and catapulted her into a fulfilling line of work as a powerful advocate in social justice and equity. She was featured in the 2020 New York Times article, Black LinkedIn is Thriving. Does LinkedIn have a problem with that? Which highlighted her social justice advocacy work. The response to this article spurred her to launch her online accessible e-learning platform, Black History and Culture Academy, the stunning educational resource which earned her recognition of LinkedIn Top Voice in Education in 2020. In early 2021, Elizabeth launched her website directory, Black Women Handle Business, which is the premier website for Black women entrepreneurs and professionals to network, collaborate, and share resources. She is also the host of Black Power Moves, a podcast on Ebony Media covering Black America Podcast Network, and is a published writer, of which she will share of her 2 pieces, one of which is I'm Not Yelling, and her upcoming piece that will hit shelves soon, Protecting My Peace. Her most recent writing includes an op-ed piece on racial profiling for CNN, which had more than 2 million views on their news website. Please join us in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished panel. We also have Serena Reed as well, and she will be a part of this conversation. She is a local advocate in this space as well, and she will join us and share her expertise. So I thank you, and we are going on to our presentations. Joyce, you're presenting.
All right, thank you. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
There, okay, thank
Yes.
you. Thank you everyone who's joined us, and thank you for welcoming today. I am humbled by this panel. I am so thankful for the other panelists and the work that you're doing, and I'm so humbled to be at this table. So thank you. So I'm here because I'm a librarian and life is really frenetic right now. Equally important though, I'm here because I want to protect access to information for our students, our children, our library patrons, our readers, everyone on this call today. I want to help protect access to information for people in burgs of under 2,000 and cities of over 2 million. And I want to talk about the practical ways that we can do some of that work. And to share a little more about myself, so I'm a parent of 2 boys, 9 and 12, and they are opposite ends of a spectrum. My 12-year-old he's a brilliant guy. He has been reading and talking about how engines work since he was 3. And my 9-year-old is learning to read right now. And this fall, he wrote a full sentence for the first time. So if my 12-year-old can't access books that challenge him in his middle school because they're moved to the high school or they're moved to the public library, he's going to miss out. And if Roby Harris's book, It's Perfectly Normal, or It's Not the Stork, is removed from my 9-year-old's elementary school, he may not have access to have a book where he can understand that topic through pictures. Both my sons are biracial. Both of them have queer family members. So take away books related to race or the LGBT community, and you remove some of their lived experience and some of their family history. So in the next few minutes, I hope to give all of us some support that we need to provide this access to information, and make sure that we have the right to choose what books are right for our family, for ourselves, and not judge our neighbors' choices, and learn how to be advocates together. So I'm going to dive in, and I'm not going to get too involved with the background of what's being banned right now or the law, because I know that our other panelists know so much more about both of those areas. As Kamilah mentioned, I work for the Freedom to Read Foundation. We are associated with the American Library Association, but one word up there is different, and that's litigation. We're a separate not-for-profit, therefore we're able to litigate on First Amendment cases. As you can imagine, we have had a very busy last year and a half. We've been involved in writing and participating in a number of briefs, including the recent House Bill 900 in Texas, where a judge determined that no, you can't just summarily decide what's inappropriate for our kids. I work with the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. We provide confidential support for librarians and educators and community members who are going through challenges. We will write letters of support to school boards and library boards and others, but we do that with support of local people. In other words, we would reach out to the California Library Association. Beth Ren Estes is the director, and we'd say, is it appropriate for us to write this letter, or is this community more open to you? And if not either of us, who's this community open to? Where should this letter originate? And public awareness, Banned Books Week. So I encourage you to become familiar with the Office for Intellectual Freedom and report challenges. And I'm going to briefly mention the Merit Fund. This is separate from FTRF and ALA. This is a fund that exists for library workers who are either experiencing discrimination in the workplace or their job is threatened due to their defense of intellectual freedom. They can apply for a grant to retain an attorney or to cover COBRA for a month. And if that doesn't cut it, then they can reapply for assistance. So I want everyone to be aware that that exists if you know someone in that need. I'm going to share a couple definitions so we're all on the same page. Intellectual freedom, the right of unrestricted access to information protected by the First Amendment. And censorship, the effort to ban, prohibit, remove, label, or restrict library materials. I always want to share this definition because people think censorship, they think burning a pile of books or just literally removing them from the library. But sometimes if you move a group of titles, you're causing an interference in that access to information. If you label materials, people may feel prohibited from going to get them. So there are many ways. If a librarian says, you know what, I'm not going to buy this book because I might get in trouble with a parent or a principal or my board, I'm just not going to buy it so I don't have the problem. That's censorship. And the more this takes hold, the more this censorship takes hold, the more chilling effect it has in our libraries and in our schools. And finally, what is our public library? It is a limited public forum, and that means we are the only institution set aside by the government for one purpose, and that's access to information. And when we create our policies, those time, place, and manner rules, they have to fit within the First Amendment. They have to fit within local, state, and federal laws, and they have to be applied in a non-discriminatory manner, and they need to be content neutral. I should note too, and we might hear more about this from our ACLU representative, but our students do not lose their First Amendment rights when they walk in the classroom door. I want to point out a couple of documents because recently we hear a lot in the news about, oh, all the librarians are these staunch liberals and they're pushing an agenda, et cetera, et cetera. The principles that we adhere to have been around since 1939. It's a wonderful document. And I want to point out too, in the Library Bill of Rights, libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historic issues. And we hold that in a balance with the ALA Code of Ethics, also adopted in 1939. And then within the last decade, we added to that, and we added the 9th Code of Ethics, which focuses on enhancing diversity and inclusion, advancing racial and social justice in our libraries, communities, profession, and associations. So librarians and library workers and our educators and school library media centers are called to uphold this Bill of Rights and this code of ethics in the work that we're doing every day. So our roles as librarians and trustees are different. It's interesting, I'm a trustee at my local public library, and we leave the work of collection development, what we're going to buy and why we're going to buy it, and the wonderful services and engaging programs and story times to our library workers who are trained and know how to buy this. They know how to purchase materials that fit that collection development policy, and that policy is going to uphold First Amendment rights. Our trustees also need to receive some education on the fact that they need to put their personal convictions aside. They need to uphold these policies. They need to uphold these codes of ethics, and follow through with their fiduciary duty. So when I talk about policies in the library, I'm talking about collection development, why we buy what we buy, reconsideration, the process we go through, because we all have a right to say we don't like a material or we don't think it should be in the library. And library workers and educators will take that seriously and they will follow the process. So those are our policies for collection development, reconsideration. We have to have meeting room policies. If we open our meeting room to the public, that becomes a limited public forum. Same with our displays, same with our social media accounts. We can have patron behavior policies, and then finally, staff. So when people say, well, what's going on? I feel like we've gone through a phase of challenges. We started with like challenges 1.0, a one-on-one conversation. Someone would come up to us 5-7 years ago and say, I don't like Harry Potter, it's the devil, and I don't want it in the library. And you'd have a calm conversation about why it's there, what can we find for you or your family that's suitable instead. And if it got to it, okay, well, we have a form you can fill out. We have a process. Then we got to challenges 2.0, where organized, well-funded groups would come and they may try to circumvent the process, which is not following the law. And they would say, here's a list of 10, 20, 100, 200 titles that I don't want. And by the way, they're all related to either race or LGBTQ content or sex ed. And we just want them all out. And then finally, we've hit challenges 3.0, and that's where we're starting to experience legislation promoting censorship. But we've got good news in at least 2 states, including your state of California. And I'll let another presenter speak to that more, or I'll cover it in Q&A. But there is good news. The other good news is that our judges have been relying on cases supporting the First Amendment, and that our Federal Department of Education Office for Civil Rights is now starting a program where they will get reports if students or their family members want to report that a student's First or 14th Amendment has been violated because they've been prevented access to information. So librarians have to deal with all 3 of these phases. We have to be ready for what walks in the door. These are some of the ways that this is manifesting. Groups targeting boards. I mentioned content. criminal complaints against library staff, and adverse legislation. I'm from Southwest Michigan. We play a lot of hockey there, less hockey probably than in California, but I call this the hockey stick because we kept this flat for like 2 decades. And then with the pandemic, challenges went down. People started focusing more heavily on masking mandates. Then it shot up. The internet helps things move rapid fire. Like I said, a number of groups organized. And the reason in the disparity between the number of challenges and titles is because that's where you see groups challenging multiple titles at a time.
Wow.
So what happens when these titles are retained? What's the good news? When these titles are kept in the library, again, I know Elizabeth will speak to this more than me, but I want to note that First Book is coming out with the results of their diverse classroom books impact study. And they have good news for when we keep these books in our classrooms. I'm going to zip through law because we have someone from the ACLU here. What I want to note is that when people throw out terms like, well, I'm going to show you this one picture and it's pornographic, or this is obscene, or this is harmful to minors, those are each a legal term. And you cannot just throw it out because you think that. So obscenity, a judge would determine that. And the one thing I want to point out is that the last 2 bullets here, the work must be taken as a whole. In other words, you can't just look at that one picture and say this work should be out. Harmful to minors, you're going to look at material to determine if it's obscene and then adjust it for age. And I want to focus in on viewpoint discrimination. And this is where I think we also need to have more education for our trustees and others. Time and time again, courts have determined you can't remove content just based on your opinion of it. So why be an advocate against book bans? We've got to be advocates against book bans because public libraries should not receive bomb threats. Library directors should not get fired because of small vocal groups' blatant viewpoint discrimination. Librarians and teachers should not be afraid to buy these books for their collections that members of their community and their students want and need to see. So I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about what we can do. Run for local office, run for your school or library board. And if you can't get your mother to run, get your cousin to run. Learn as much as you can and encourage people to add to community resources rather than taking them away. And then visit Unite Against Book Bans. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So in July, former President Barack Obama wrote an open letter thanking librarians for the work that they're doing in this country. And he pointed out the fact that we have to make a difference together. The free, robust exchange of ideas has been at the heart of American democracy. And what I love about Unite Against Book Bans is that it's nonpartisan. The statistics are ones you can share with anyone. I like to note when some people say, well, this is a Republican thing, this is a liberal thing. It's like, this is an extreme thing. It's extreme to say, my kid can't read this and your kid can't either. The reason I also like Unite Against Book Bans, it was developed a year ago as a campaign because ALA staff realized we can't always, well, not we can't. School librarians, public librarians can't always shoulder these challenges, especially if they're afraid they might lose their job or something might happen to them. If they're in a town where they're being threatened by Proud Boys or any other group, this is a way for community members to become advocates. We have 100 national partner organizations. The challenge toolkit and talking points are short, common sense, and as Elizabeth may or may not bring this up, but this keeps those windows and mirrors open and present for our children. They can see themselves, they can understand the lives of others. We can rely on our communities, our faith leaders, our educators, our friends, our family, and we can show up on behalf of librarians and educators. This is just a few of the talking points from that website. And I'm noting this because a librarian will often be talking with someone and giving a much more defined, in-depth explanation, but these are perfect for community members to share. So I'm going to stop there because I know that Elizabeth and where's our other presenter have much more to say. Sorry, I feel like I'm looking at Hollywood squares here. Anyways, I will stop sharing now. And after all of us are done talking, I look forward to Q&A with you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That was just rich information. I took notes. I don't know if anybody else took notes, but I took a lot of notes, and I'm certain others have as well. And I encourage everyone in the audience to write down your questions, because when we get to the end, we'll give you the opportunity to put those questions in the chat or ask if you want more information. But thank you, Joyce, for that just in-depth overview. And Miss Elizabeth, you're up next, sister. Oh, I think you're muted. You got it?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. This is really an honor and a pleasure to be here to speak with you. For me, it's evening because I'm on the East Coast, but I'm really excited to speak about a topic that is really near and dear to me as an author. To just give a little bit of personal background about myself, I was born in the United Kingdom and raised in London. I'm an immigrant to the United States. From the age of 12, I lived in Florida, which is one of the hot spots for book banning and the crusade against Black history and wokeism and CRT and all of the things. And those are some of the things that I grew up, the challenges that I grew up with in the state of Florida after going to the University of Florida. And I think that in my book, I talk about the fact that learning Black history saved my life. So I think it's really important to understand the historical context of this, because for myself as a historian, we always say nothing is new under the sun. And this is something, as Joyce alluded to, that has happened definitely with Banned Book Week being something that has been around for quite a few decades. We know that this is not new. So I think I always look at things through that historical lens and also through a personal lens. For myself, coming to America as an immigrant, I did not understand the Black American experience because growing up in the UK with parents from the Caribbean, we didn't have a lot of context about what it means to be Black in America. So for me, I did not have a sense of identity that was grounded in the Black experience here on this soil. And I always tell those that I speak with in public forums that really the only thing that separates us is a boat drop off, because anyone across the African diaspora is, our culture is rooted in Africa. So I really wanted to understand how my experience as a immigrant of Caribbean descent would be different. And I really, in high school, dove into the works of Malcolm X and Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison, Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. These were some of the, Carter G. Woodson. These were some of the books that community members, many of them from fraternities and sororities that were our teachers, because I went to a predominantly Black school on the east side of Fort Lauderdale, they brought those books in and went to the local Black bookstore, purchased them, and brought them into the classroom because those books were not necessarily available. And I think for me, opening up Sheikh Anta Diop and seeing pyramids and knowing that my culture did not begin, my skin color and all the richness around African and African American culture did not begin with slavery. And I think there's so much toxic messaging that's going on around this idea that slavery was beneficial, around this idea that there was no culture in Africa. Mary McKeeba said, "The conqueror came, the conqueror wrote." And then it was, right? Because there's nothing until somebody typically says it or writes it down. There isn't anything until you've processed it and then you've presented it. And that's what happened. Civilizations and astronomy and mathematics and great architecture and everything that was found there was destroyed. And the history of what was there was destroyed and kept from the descendants of those brilliant civilizations, which is us. We are their legacy. So I think it's really important that we understand just how really critical it is for us to hold on to the history of our ancestors. That blood is pulsing through all of our veins. They sacrificed for us. I read something on social media and it said, "We are the children of the slaves you could not kill." And that is the truth, because they were able to overcome immense struggle when we think about what they had to go through, packed on top of each other on slave ships, jumping off and killing themselves, unaliving themselves, because they did not want to be in chains. And when I think about this idea of slavery, and when you have this narrative that's being painted about us as a people, it becomes really apparent to me that the banning of books is really there to really stop people from feeling shame. When we think about what our history is greatness, our history is excellence, our history is phenomenal. But then you have our history that was interrupted. Slavery is not Black history, slavery is American history. That what they did to us is their history, it has nothing to do with us. They interrupted our history. So when we think about why it's so important for our children to have access to this information, it really is a matter of life and death. When I think about the idea that children's identities are really being robbed from them and they will not have access to accurate information, that in itself creates, I usually compare it to children that are of adoption. If that's not explained to them properly, your parents did love you, but they were not able to take care of you. And I took you in and I love you, but you do have a mother and a father that loves you too. Often those conversations are not had. And you see children will have mental health issues. They will get into addiction. They will have a lack of sense of self. And what we're seeing across the African diaspora is just that our history has been hidden. Our history has been lied about. And therefore, we really don't know who we are or where we came from unless we have those resources within which we are able to, as I did at the age of 11, dive into who am I? Where am I from? And I think the deliberate banning of books really, as I say, it's a banning of shame, because if you think about this country and everything that they have done to the African descendants of slaves, or what I typically say is the children of stolen and sold Africans. We are not slaves. We were never slaves. We were victims of human trafficking. And our history is one of overcoming everything that they did to destroy us. And now what they're doing is trying to destroy the evidence of what they have done. And that in itself is wrong, ethically and morally and legally, to take history, misconstrue, lie, manipulate it, and not allow our children, whether they be Black children, particularly for our children, but also for white children, to understand this is very much the history of America. Why I started doing this, writing and speaking and being very vocal on social media, particularly on LinkedIn, is because I saw people as a 20 plus year educator myself. I taught in K through 12, and I've taught and worked in higher education for about 20 years or so. What I saw was a lot of clutching of pearls. What I saw was people saying, this is not America. And as someone that teaches American history and American literature, and is very much a reader of all things Black and all things African and everything about our culture and everything about the American existence in this for Black folk, I said, this is very much America. This is the foundation of America. And to deny our children from learning about that is to set the stage for these things to happen again. If we don't know the history, if we don't have access to the history, if our children are not taught their greatness and who they really are, we will have a repeat of a cycle, which is what history is. These pushbacks have always happened. After Reconstruction, these things have happened. After the Civil Rights Movement, these things have happened. I was glad that Joyce put the dates up of when these challenges escalated right after George Floyd was murdered. So these things that are happening across the country are not new. But the great thing about what has happened is now there is a lot more access to information, which makes us more ready and able to challenge those challenges and ensure that we create dialogue around why Black history and culture is essential for all children to know, understand, and learn. Primarily, that should be happening in K through 12. And Joyce did allude to this idea that often educators, when there is a challenge, there's a chilling effect on some of these books that are essential to just identity. The Bluest Eye was one of the ones that really taught me about the beauty of myself. And reading Maya Angelou stories, those also taught me about the beauty of myself. So as a young Black girl, if you don't have access to those layers of information about who you really are, it really will create later, as we're seeing currently, Black women having, and Black folk in general, but particularly Black women having a really hard time in corporate America, record rates of mental health and stress and exhaustion. A lot of people are exhausted and don't know why. And it's because of all these things that we're seeing. Challenging our books and challenging the representation of who we are is a challenge to our identity. And it's very difficult to go into the world knowing that your actual identity is being targeted as something that is superfluous, is not needed. My governor in the state of Florida said that as well. We don't need this. We don't want this. This makes us feel bad or guilty. And it reminds me of Nazi Germany or any other culture or any other country where if you don't study the history and acknowledge it and really be willing to address it and do so in meaningful ways, it is destined to repeat itself. And we're seeing that with the rise of hate crimes and the rise of white supremacist groups and things of that nature, because people feel that their right to oppress others is being threatened. So we really have to arm our children with these tools so that when they go into the world, they are properly prepared to understand what is really happening, that it's not all peaches and cream and rainbows. We have a great segment of society, probably 50% or so at this point, that want a radical demagogue back in the office of the presidency. So this idea of suppressing our history, I think I take it extremely personally because I feel as though history is a foundation of what we need as Black folk to build so that we understand our greatness and our children understand their greatness too. Representation matters. So when young Black children see themselves in books, they're able to understand who they are and their place in the world and see themselves reflected in society. If you don't see yourself reflected in society, there's really a misconception that you don't belong in society or that you're invisible in society. That also leads to self-esteem issues. It also deals with and leads to mental health and emotional issues because you're living a walking identity crisis, which is very harmful to the psyche of our young people. It's also a reflection of larger cultural tension. So when we don't have the construct of these books to be able to discern what has happened historically, as well as what's happening contemporarily, as well as what the future looks like for us as a people, we don't have a lot of context within which to really operate. And critical thinking as a teacher, I always feel like intellectual freedom, the ability of children, young people to challenge what they see and ask questions, to interrogate what they see and not take everything for face value, for them to have the ability to develop critical thinking skills, not just around history, but just around the world in the context of why things are the way they are. If you don't have a foundation of knowledge to build on, you're really lost and you really don't have any framework to really work from. So I think it's really important that we understand just how historically that has hampered us. There was a reason that enslaved Africans were not allowed to read, and it was against the law because knowledge is power. Knowledge leveraged is power, and action is power. But if you have nothing to start with, which is that knowledge, then you don't have any power. And that's really by design. There's been a lot of debate on critical race theory and this whole idea of wokeism. And really, what that is just truth. Critical race theory by Kimberly Crenshaw really is just this idea of intersectionality and just how much harder it is when you're navigating this system and institutions that really were not designed with your race or your ethnicity in mind, and really have been actually designed to hamper and really create a system where you're not able to excel to the degree that you should. Not to say that we don't, because people all say, well, there's Oprah, but there's only one Oprah. So the idea that we can't learn the context of why this is happening is really troubling, because then it leads our young people to believe that if you just try harder, if you work better, if you were better, if you were good, then you would be better. And we know that that's not true. If someone, as our esteemed Sarah Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, pull up a folding chair. But what they've managed to do is lock the door so we can't even get in to pull up a folding chair. So it's really important that we understand exactly what's happening. What's happening in terms of the poor, and I often say really in every indicator of well-being, physical, mental, emotional, financial, Black folk tend to be at the bottom or near the bottom. And that is not because we don't work hard. That is because systems and structures have historically been set up that have prevented us from access to wealth, wealth generation, to education, and to knowledge, to be able to leverage that knowledge to do better. And the systems and structures really have blocked that progress. And if we don't have the books that teach those stories and give us the information to know what's happening, then that also puts us at a disadvantage. Another thing that these types of books and resources do is it create community solidarity. So by us having shared knowledge, I always say that our history and our culture is one of collectivism. So by sharing knowledge, that's how we have always been able to be successful, whether that was on the continent of Africa or whether that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, whether that has been during the civil rights movement or during these recent movements such as Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd. Community has really been what the Black community has been able to utilize and leverage to be more successful. But if we don't have a sense of community through shared knowledge, our culture is built on the idea of storytelling and narrative, and it has always been that way ever since the African beginning of time, which we know that the civilization of the world began there. But if we don't have that knowledge, then this cycle of low self-esteem, the cycle of the school to prison pipeline, the cycle of not having adequate access to education becomes this perpetual cycle where we can only get ahead so far because the powers that be really want to keep a structure where they remain in power at the top and everyone else is really at the bottom. So I think a lot of what I think about as I pretty much close out is that really I love this idea and this really push and initiative for librarians to be more active, for the community to be more active, for us as members of historically Black Greek organizations to really empower the community and provide resources for the community. Because by us as a community coming together, we are able to really create more of a movement that is not really relying on our legislators that a lot of the time really seem very hell bent really on making sure that we don't have the access to this knowledge. So really the empowerment that comes from librarians that want to continue to maintain this resource, this information that our young people need is really important. A lot of times teachers don't necessarily have the backing from administration or the district to be able to fight these fights. So us in the community really have to pick up that mantle and make sure that we are educated and aware of what's happening, and that we also empower ourselves to educate our young people. That's what we have always done. I think James Baldwin and also Malcolm X said that it's really dangerous to let people that don't love us educate us. And it's really important that we love and educate ourselves as well as our children, our young people. They're relying on us. And it's really incumbent on us to make sure that we hold that mantle strong so that they can get the knowledge that they need. One of the things that I have taken it upon myself to do is I launched, as was mentioned in the intro, my Black History and Culture Academy in 2021. I actually launched it on the day of the Capitol uprising because even though I planned to do it for Black History Month, when I saw people running up the stairs and smashing the windows of the Capitol, I really felt as though I had to roll these resources out. And it for the past 2 years or so, yeah, 2 years, it has been a paid subscription resource where people could pay like a Netflix $14.99 a month to have access to 30 plus courses, which I built and designed myself. I'm a director of instructional design and innovation for a corporation that owns career colleges. However, in the past 4 months or so, I decided to open it up and actually remove the subscription cost and open it up for free for parents, educators, and students, as well as K through 12 students, as well as recent college graduates and college students. So that resource is actually available. And I will drop the link in the chat for anybody that would like to share that resource with others. But it is called Black History and Culture Academy, and I rebranded it to ensure that it was really child and student friendly. But we have a lot of, there's about 750 or so students, educators, and also parents that are daily joining that website and accessing the resources about Black history, Black literature, African history and culture, oral literature, contemporary Black culture, about natural hair, about just anything that you can think of, African dance, anything that I could think of that would really empower young people to understand just how amazing and just how full and just how rich our culture is. I encourage people to, all of us really, to continue to learn, to continue to grow, continue to amplify, and continue to exhibit what our true history and legacy is, which is one of power, which is one of strength, and which is one of amazing resilience. And I appreciate the ability to share, get emotional thinking about this, just
Listen,
exactly
I almost,
how excellent our culture is, and we have to keep that alive. Thank you.
sister, I almost like I was captivated, and I'm sure everyone else was. I mean, just from the burning, reframing it to calling it banning of shame, and the destroying of evidence is what it's done. And even starting out when you said learning Black history saved my life. I mean, my goodness, that hit to the heart. And I appreciate your transparency, your experiences, your personal story, and just all of the resources. Oh my gosh. Whew. Okay, everybody take a breath. Take a breath. That was fulfilling. Ms. Watson, we are going to loop you into the conversation. Again, she is the senior staff attorney with the ACLU, specifically their racial justice program. And I can't wait to see the richness that she adds to this dialogue. And then after that, we will all come back and have a Q&A open discussion, if you will. Okay, Ms. Watson.
Well, thanks again for having me. It's very hard to follow Elizabeth and Joyce, but I will do my best. I feel like a brief break may have been in order after both of those heavy hitters. But I am here to talk about the fight to preserve the right to learn, both the banned books aspect, but also the broader context of what is happening in the attack on classroom instruction. I have a PowerPoint that I will attempt to share my screen. Okay, can y'all see that?
Yes.
Now I just have to make it start. Okay. So here I'm starting with the fight to preserve the right to learn. As you mentioned, I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU in the national office. My practice focuses on classroom censorship, and it's something I'm very passionate about as a former teacher. So when I like to talk about classroom censorship, I think that Elizabeth and Joyce mentioned the importance of 2020, but I just like to start a few years before that and looking at 2017, because in 2017, for the first time ever in our country's history, white students became the minority in American public schools. And this was really a turning point that we've been talking about, approaching for years, decades. But suddenly in 2017, I really think that this is a point that shook up a lot of people, where for a very vocal minority of white people, they began to really viscerally see that their power, as they saw it, slipping away, and really put people on a defensive mode. Then we come over to 2020, after the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We had this brief racial reckoning, and everyone was talking about what it meant. What was racial justice? What were their responsibilities for anti-racism? There was a lot of support for Black Lives Matter. In fact, support skyrocketed, making it the biggest social justice movement ever, with over 500,000 Americans reporting that they protested on a single day. And the overwhelming majority of Americans, 60 to 70% of people, agreeing for the first time, Black lives do actually matter. As insane as it is to think about that this is monumental. But in those discussions after the racial reckoning, parents, teachers, citizens were talking about what are the obligations of businesses to progress racial justice, and what are the obligations of schools as well. It was a moment to pause and think about the fact that schools have never fully accommodated or responded to the needs of Black and Brown children. We haven't been represented within the curriculum out. And to the extent we have been represented, it's limited to certain instances, like Elizabeth was saying, where it might start with the history of enslaved people, as if that's when Black people began. And so there were lots of discussions about what should happen. There were commitments from schools to increase their ethnic studies resources, to commitments from teachers to diversify the narratives represented in their courses. So when they're teaching about colonial times, they're not only teaching from the white man's perspective, but bringing in texts from Black women and other people who were impacted so that students could see themselves in the text. And there were the beginnings of progress. And just like anything else in our country's history, when we have progress, there's also backlash. So in 2020, someone named Christopher Rufo, a relatively unknown journalist in Seattle at the time, began reporting about critical race theory infiltrating our classrooms and government. He was referencing training materials from trainings, exaggerating materials from trainings, but he appeared on Fox News twice, stating that critical race theory is a problem and it's everywhere in our governments, everywhere in our classrooms. Nothing really happened the first time he appeared on Fox News, but then he came back again for a second time in September 2020, and he looked directly at the camera on Tucker Carlson's show and said, I want to make it very clear, the White House can fix this and President Trump can fix this. And guess what? They called the next day. President Trump's chief of staff called the very next day, said the president had seen the segment. They flew Christopher Rufo out, and this current iteration of classroom censorship began. The way that it began, however, was that the federal government, the White House, issued an executive order 13950, which basically prohibited 8 concepts as divisive, so-called divisive. And these are concepts that discuss systemic racism and sexism. And the executive order said no contractors that work with the federal government can provide these trainings or even offer these trainings offline when they're not outside of their federal government responsibilities. We're not going to work with anyone who offers these trainings because that alone is discrimination. When you look at the text of Executive Order 13950, which was issued in September of 2020, there is a little nugget there that says this may not be applicable in the education context or due to academic freedom. And there were initially in 2020, there were efforts at the federal level. I'm from Arkansas, so Senator Cotton from Arkansas introduced legislation from my home state, but there were various efforts at the federal level to stop critical race theory and to enforce these prohibitions on instruction around systemic racism and sexism at the federal level. But those really halted after the presidential election of 2020. And then we saw conservatives pivot to a state-based strategy that included education. So here I have some headlines: critical race theory is under attack. And I just want to pause here for a second to say that conservatives have been talking about critical race theory as if it's some boogeyman, but they don't actually mean critical race theory. They mean any reference to racism and race, and it's so much broader. So we have critical race theory, which Elizabeth explained. It's a framework that is utilized primarily in higher education, but it basically traces the way that law has facilitated the racism and racial outcomes that we see today. It explains how we can have a Black man who can be president and simultaneously 3 times more likely to be killed by police in an encounter. That's not necessarily immediately true for students who might look around and see we have a Black president, we have a Black vice president, we have Black women, a Black woman and man on the Supreme Court. And there's all these declarations of post-war, post-racism America, but we're not there, to be frank, as I'm sure you all know. So in addition to critical race theory, which is tracing how institutions how racism is baked into institutions. We also have just other ways that people talk about racism. I was a teacher. One way, there are classroom discussions about discrimination and about systemic racism. We've had any number of massacres motivated by racism. Most recently in Jacksonville, last year we had Buffalo, and teachers can't talk about these current events with their students because the people perpetuating these acts of violence admit that they're due to racist motivations. And so there's a variety of ways that just discussion of racism comes up in classrooms that's not separate from critical race theory. The third category that I would say is that there were a number of methods called culturally relevant teaching or culturally responsive teaching. These are teaching methods that have been since the 90s. So for 3 decades have been identified to consistently produce higher levels of engagement, academic outcomes, and social outcomes for students because it builds on their personal experiences and invites them into the lessons that they are learning at school. So they are encouraged to learn about math, science, English, building upon their personal experiences. It helps them understand their own social identity, whether as a white student or a student of color, and they are better apt to understand other people's social identity. So when we think about the expansions that were happening in the racial in the aftermath of the racial reckoning, a lot of those were around increasing the culturally relevant teaching methods to make sure that students felt seen and celebrated within the curriculum. All 3 of these, which I would collectively argue are race-conscious instruction, are under attack. It's just not critical race theory. And I think that term has been used as, to obscure the breadth of what's at stake here. So the impact of this attack on critical race theory is that, as Joyce has told you, teachers and librarians aren't talking about race at all. And we've seen a wide array of censorship efforts. By 2022, just 2 years, actually almost a little over 1 year after these censorship efforts began, 35% of K-12 students, or 17.7 million students, attended districts that attended some type of censorship efforts. We saw educators censoring themselves even when topics weren't explicitly banned because they're subject to laws, or it's not just legislation, but we're seeing, various restrictions at the school district level. We've also seen them from state attorney generals, from the governor's office, executive orders. So it's coming at them, teachers, from a variety of ways, restricting their ability to talk about racism and sexism. Sometimes educators provide completely inaccurate information, building upon what Elizabeth said, looking at the African American studies standards that were announced in Florida that are blatantly inaccurate and misrepresenting a whole host of things, from whether or not the founding fathers of this country owned enslaved people to whether or not enslavement actually benefited the enslaved persons. We've seen syllabi, curriculum, course offerings change. As I mentioned, people can talk about current events. As Joyce mentioned, there were over 1,200 book challenges compared to 300 in 2019. Most of these banned books were attacking BIPOC authors, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and or LGBTQ authors. What started as an attack on race has expanded to an attack on race as well as our LGBTQ community. And most importantly, we've seen a culture of fear, intimidation, surveillance, and security, including bills to record teachers just to catch them. As one Mississippi legislator said, she wanted to catch teachers teaching critical race theory. Also a bill that was introduced in Indiana that would allow anyone to come in off the street to audit a classroom. Given the violence that we've seen against students, particularly K-12 students, I think we all can understand why that's not only wrong, but very dangerous. And then in New Hampshire, Moms for Liberty issued a bounty where they said they would pay $500 to the first person who was able to catch a teacher violating the law. And so the impacts really cannot be overstated. And in this fight for inclusive education, I'm really proud to be at the ACLU because we have been leading the fight through litigation. We filed the first law to a classroom. We filed the first lawsuit challenging a classroom censorship law in Oklahoma. This is the first one in the country. It's Burt v. O'Connor. In this case, BERT stands for the Black Emergency Response Team, is a group of students who came together in the wake of racist incidents at the University of Oklahoma to demand change. They negotiated with their administration and were able to have changes, have them commit to changes, including requiring a mandatory diversity class, because they had both students and professors using racial slurs on campus. In the wake of this law, the class went from mandatory to optional, but we're also representing the Oklahoma chapter of the American Association of University Professors, the Oklahoma chapter of the NAACP, a number of K-12 students and parents, and then also teachers as well. And in Oklahoma, just another example of what happened in the wake of the law passing, there's one school district, Norman School District, which wrote, they instructed their English teachers, do not say white supremacy in class. You can't talk about these, gave them a list of things. They changed the books that could be read in class to include texts like what Elizabeth mentioned, The Bluest Eye. And we saw a number of changes, the chilling number of changes that happened immediately, but also the broader chilling effect that when people don't know where the line is between prohibited and permissive conduct, they err on the side of avoiding what could be prohibited, which means even things that are arguably not impacted by the law, they're still kept out of classrooms, and students are still deprived of that. Local 8027 versus Edelbud is a lawsuit that we filed to challenge the law in New Hampshire. This was House Bill 2, and we filed our case in conjunction with the American Federation of Teachers. There was another lawsuit by the NEA, the National Education Association. They were consolidated into one challenge. And so that case is on behalf of K-12 teachers challenging a law. They survived a motion to dismiss, and we are waiting further judgment. And then the last case is Purnell v. Lamb. This is a case that we filed challenging the higher education provisions of Florida's Stop Woke Act. We are really excited to obtain a preliminary injunction that blocks the state from enforcing the higher ed provisions. Of course, the state of Florida has appealed, and we are in the process of arguing before the 11th Circuit in a case. I highlight Purnell because it is moving the fastest of the litigation. There have also been challenges at the state level to individual book bans across the country. But I just wanted to highlight that the book bans are such an important part of it, and something that we haven't, recurrence we haven't seen since the McCarthy era, but we see so many other pieces moving quickly. I'll note that at the ACLU, we recognize that this is both a racial justice issue and a free speech issue. It cannot be, you can't only focus on the First Amendment aspect of it, because it's very clearly motivated by racist motivations. And even the person who started this hysteria around critical race theory, Christopher Rufo, he said publicly that this attack on critical race theory was the most successful counterattack to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so all of this has been motivated, really spurred by the fear that more is happening to create progress. So very quickly on this Florida case, I will skip the descriptions of the law. It basically prohibits discussion of racism and sexism. And the legislators frame this law, interestingly, as anti-discrimination law, which is something else we have to look out for, because anti-discrimination wins that have traditionally fallen within the civil rights sphere are being manipulated as a way to weaponize, to target communities of color, not protect them. And here we represent 8 plaintiffs, 7 instructors, 1 student. We have Professor Purnell, who is a professor at FAMU Law School. He can't even teach his students about race and criminal procedure. Dr. Marvin Dunn, who lived through the Jim Crow era and can't talk about his own experiences. And for example, Dr. Dana Thompson Dorsey, who teaches students about education law, and she can't even explain the full context of Brown or Plessy due to the Stop Woke Act. Our claims here, we talked about the legality of these censorship measures. And the claims here the claims that we brought fall into a few categories under the First and 14th Amendment. I think Joyce spoke about viewpoint-based discrimination, and it's just recognizing that the government is not supposed to limit us to one perspective only that's been endorsed by the government. This is blatantly prohibited across First Amendment jurisprudence, and recognizing that these laws or these measures, by banning books, the government is taking position. You can only review the messages or have access to the messages that we approve. You can read unlimited books saying that racism isn't real, that systemic racism isn't real, but you can't read any books that pertain to the realities of racism by people experiencing it. In addition, we brought a right to information claim, which says that students have a right to receive a variety of perspectives and then decide what they believe. They, especially, and this is something that's really important at the high school and collegiate level or higher ed level, that students should be able to process information, decide their own opinion. And then another challenge that we have brought is the vagueness challenge, because a lot of these laws use very vague, sweeping language. They want to sweep in as many things as they can to get you to stop talking about race. And it's not just as a basic manner of fairness and as a legal manner of due process. You have to be clear, because we're talking about civil penalties or criminal penalties, where the line is. What is the line that you will be penalized if you cross? As Joyce mentioned, we have seen in the book context, we've seen legislation that has criminal sanctions for librarians, proposing criminal sanctions for teachers. In the classroom instruction context, we've seen laws pass that would remove teachers, like they would rescind the teachers' licenses, suspension, termination, a host of penalties. And then even for institutions, there can be institutional penalties where if a school doesn't stop instruction or potentially keeps a book in, they can be subject to losing all of their statewide funding. So conservatives are willing to shut down institutions in order to further their censorious goals. And then finally, in Oklahoma and in Florida, we brought claims that the laws were racially discriminatory, that they targeted Black professors and educators in Florida, and then professors and students of color in Oklahoma. So I mentioned the Florida case. It is moving along. It's in the circuit court already. So we are expecting a judgment in this case probably next year, and likely to continue briefing at the Supreme Court, though that's not to say the Supreme Court will accept the case, just that we're expecting briefing to continue there. And then I wanted to just give some other resources. Here we have the ACLU has a Right to Learn toolkit that has information about starting a banned books club, about writing to the school board or showing up to school board meetings, how to discuss your perspective at school board meetings. A lot of the classroom censorship has been perpetuated or represented in the media as a parents' movement, but it's not a parents' movement. It's just a vocal minority of parents. And we have to make sure that parents, students, teachers are able to speak up and have their voice heard. We've seen a lot of gains across the country at the school board level when we have other parents and students speaking up. We also have a number of resources here. There's a lessons learned from our Classroom Censorship Win Against Florida Stop Woke Act. That's something I authored. 10 books politicians don't want you to read. And then more about the toolkit. I think I just covered this for the toolkit. And then also we had a shout out to your librarian, a love letters to librarian campaign that we did around Valentine's Day, because I always tell people, I've never met a teacher who became a teacher because they want to hurt kids. And I'm certain that's true for librarians too. So the people most at risk are people who are there risking their livelihood to do what's best by kids. They don't deserve this at all. And we have to protect them. And then I have some other resources here. What the fight against classroom censorship is really about. That's another blog post that I that I authored earlier. Well, I guess we're in October. So earlier last month, around back to school, I have a long form piece that was recently published, 64 pages, about critical race theory campaign that is running in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and then the toolkit. So I will stop there. I've lost track of time, so I'm sorry if that ran long, but really looking forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you so much. I just felt like this was all seamless, like we painted a map, if you will. Thank you so much for Ms. Watson for all the information, specifically the cases and the advocacy and the legal work that's going on in and around the country centered around censorship and banned books. Okay, our first question, if you all want to unmute yourselves, our first question comes from Michelle Hafford. It says, how can we better support local librarians in schools in local areas? I guess particularly, I think she's saying in this area, but I'm sure some of the things you spoke to we can do in our local areas as well. Anyone can chime in with that.
Well, one thing that I would recommend is finding out if this is a time when they want support. And if they do, set up a schedule of people to show up at that public library or school board meeting. And a local group where I live, they started a calendar. It was an indivisible group, and they started a calendar where people sign up to attend the school board meetings. And that way, whether they're needed or not, if there are other folks there, we have Turning Point USA coming to our meetings every month and basically trying to talk about banning books and a whole list of items. So if they get up and speak, we have twice as many people get up and speak. So just finding out what people need and showing up as a community member. If you need help doing that, you can look at Unite Against Book Bans. You can read Leah's work, which, by the way, I've been admiring for a long time. And Elizabeth, I cannot wait to look at your website because I'm realizing in these conversations, there are many ways to hop on board and become an advocate if you aren't already. And no way is the absolute right way. In other words, there are so many ways to do it, so many resources. Find what's the best fit for you and show up.
I think one thing you touched on too, Joyce, earlier, if you can expand, and certainly the other panelists, if you can expand upon it, you talked about library trustees and their roles. And I don't know, I think that's something that we know about school boards, and those are elected positions. I know, at least in our area in North San Diego County, and maybe elsewhere, you don't hear a lot about library trustees and how one becomes that and what power they have in the role. Can you speak on that? Can any of you speak on that?
I'd like to take a first shot at that one and then see what other folks have to say. So library trustees are often elected, and if they're appointed by a county government. And you didn't hear much about this issue in public libraries until a couple of years ago because it was usually in education where the challenges took place. Now public libraries are about equal in the number of challenges. And last year, Moms for Liberty said, we're going to have a whole bunch of training sessions throughout the US, and we're going to try to get 2 candidates in every election to flip as many boards as we can. So it has become imperative at the local level, and lots of people don't even think about running at the local level. They're like, I'm going to vote for president. And they don't realize that at this point, you have got to think about the most local level you can and build up from there and get people to run. And then sometimes people run because they're like, oh, I don't like this, or oh, I want to change that. but having some training about intellectual freedom, having some training about discrimination, viewpoint discrimination, and ethics behind their role is so important.
Anybody wants to come in?
Oh, I'll weigh in really
Yeah.
briefly, if I may. I agree completely with what Joyce said, and I just wanted to even drill down a little bit more about the importance of looking for censorship in your community. This is often, I mean, we talk about Southern states a lot, but honestly, no place is immune. We've seen efforts in 45 states, over 700 efforts at the state, local, and federal level. So odds are, if they're not in your community now, they will be coming soon. And particularly in the context of books, taking time to look through the measure that has been proposed, because all measures aren't equal. And particularly when a parent complains about a book or a resource and it's automatically withdrawn, I think that that's something we really want to keep an eye out for, because it allows other parents to control, I mean, assuming that they are parents, other people to control what can be accessed within your community, what other students can access. And it's so important. Kids are in school for a very limited amount of time, and if they don't learn some of these things, they will never learn them. And so really thinking about what happens when someone says they don't like a book. It's nothing new, as Joyce mentioned, for someone to complain about a book and the librarians review it, but the librarians are trained professionals who have they have years of studying what's appropriate and what is age appropriate based on the language that's used. And so we want to make sure that we're deferring to teachers and librarians as professionals as well too. And there is so much value in showing up, just to show that the only voice, to show that this matters, and there's not just one voice, but really it is a vocal minority.
Indeed. Our next comment or question was from a panel. Could you speak on either your perspective or your professional expertise centering around parental rights legislation that's fast expanding across the states and this nation? That's that language that's being used behind this banning of books. And anyone, please jump in.
Leah, that's your field, isn't it?
Oh, unmute.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself again, but I will not do that this time. Yeah, so honestly, the parental rights bills are being used functionally as a way to increase the intimidation of teachers. And that's not to say that parents shouldn't have any rights in this context, but really to say that we have to think about we know we have to respect the First Amendment rights of students and teachers. As I think Joyce said, going back to Tinker, this is decades, for 50 years, we've known that students and teachers do not lose their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gates. That's a quote from the Supreme Court. And I think we have to be aware of what is being done in the name of transparency. We've seen a lot of laws that are so-called transparency laws, but the espoused mission of conservatives is to make it so hard for teachers to comply. Some of them are really onerous tasks where they are requiring teachers to post every single material that they could use in class, every single book, every single item, and then allow parents to demand that it won't be taught or to opt out. And the ACLU is not opposed to transparency from the government at all. We do believe the government should be transparent. However, it's really intimidating teachers in the name of transparency. And so while we're not opposed to the government being transparent, we certainly would not support any measures that are used to intimidate teachers or to chill their ability to teach certain information. And so I think taking a clear look at what the actual outcome of the bills, of these parental rights bills is important. And it's along the same lines of what I was saying about library books, where if the impact of a parent complaining is that no student will be taught information, I think that that's problematic. And also just thinking about what is the motivation? I mean, teachers have always been overworked and underpaid. And so if this is something that is going to be used to police teachers, I personally think that's really problematic.
Speaking about teachers, I think Serena had a question or wanted to open a discussion about resources for teachers. I know Joyce touched on some support for teachers who are finding that they're losing their job or being put on probation or suspension due to the materials they teach. What are some resources, kind of like what you shared, Elizabeth, that are out there and available, as well as you, Ms. Watson, for teachers? It's open for anyone to jump in.
I want to make a plug for the National Council of Teachers of English because they have a robust intellectual freedom office. They work to provide challenge support in the same way that the Office for Intellectual Freedom does. They don't get into the legal realm the way that the ACLU does, but they are an invaluable resource for teachers dealing with curriculum. That's where librarians don't, we don't cover that as much. I did want to note too, and Leah just touched on this, to some degree, these laws are just a way to legislate hate. And sometimes it takes one person showing up at a meeting and saying, we already have an opt-out policy. Families can choose if they want a different title for their students. We don't need this policy, or we don't need this. Yeah, I just wanted to note that those opt-out policies are already in place at so many of our schools and libraries that you don't need to go to the extent just to legislate racism and hate.
I appreciate your slide too, where you have the talking points. I think sometimes a barrier is people don't know what to say when they get into these venues or they're intimidated. So certainly having those talking points removes that barrier and helps people to self-advocate or advocate for their community. This next question is for Elizabeth. The banning of the books is the banning of shame was a really powerful statement, someone wrote. Would you agree that this is a type of suppression, this type of suppression is based primarily on fear, or are there additional factors?
Really good question. I think when I think about fear, the word fear has often been used and weaponized against the Black community. If I was afraid of somebody, I definitely am not going to provoke them by trying to erase their history, because I think anyone who tried to, say, erase the history of the Holocaust would not do that because they're going to say they're afraid of the Jewish community. So I feel as though when we say fear, it typically tends to be used as in the sense of comply, or in the sense of I felt threatened, as though there is something to fear from us knowing the knowledge of the truth. So for me, I feel as though it goes back to power. It goes back to this idea that that Leah really eloquently explained in terms of the browning, the blacking and browning of America, and how there is, as we've seen, as we look at what the country is doing and what has been going on over the past 8 years or so, there's a great deal of fear. But it's not fear in the sense of fear that, you know, about us as people, or any kind of fear that's founded in logic or reasoning. That fear is founded in the construct of this country, and knowing that if you were the majority, that means you have the power, you have the control, you're able to legislate, you're able to continue to marginalize, you're able to create a society and a structure that really benefits you. And if you're looking at the way that the country, the demographics of the country is shifting, then it really would be in your best interest. It's rather than even fear. It's actually very diabolical and strategic. And I don't think when you're, for me, I've been in fear and trauma, and you're not thinking like that. You're just thinking survival. So I don't think of it as fear at all. I really think of it as just a matter of fact that you have a segment of society, the majority, that has kidnapped and human trafficked a group of people, and that happened for several hundred years, and that became the lower class. And I always ask people, if we look at historically what has happened, Black folk have always had to fight for any rights that we've had. No one's ever given us anything. Even when you think about civil rights legislation, it wasn't given. We had to fight in the civil rights movement to get that legislation and those laws put into place. And then what happens is people try to circumvent them with other law or with policy or by creating obstruction, which is what this really is. So I think it is really, when I think about fear, it is fear, but it's really more of a fear of the dichotomy of this has always been. If this is not my reality, what will my reality look like? And a lot of people don't want to see a reality where Black folk have equity or Black folk have the ability to vote. When we say we fought for the right to vote, but then you gerrymander, or then you put in these laws that create obstruction for you to vote, then that shows that it's not fear. It's just, it would be disingenuous to say that they're afraid of this information. They don't want this information to be readily available. And to be honest with you, when I think about opting out, that's what a rational parent would do. If I saw a book and I'm like, I don't want my child to read this, I'll just say, I don't want my child to participate in this lesson. But they don't want anyone to get the information because knowledge, again, is power. And if we know who we are, what has happened, what history really has said, then we're able to empower ourselves. If we have a generation of students that are really the backbone of what's going to be happening in this Black and brown of America that have no idea why they're at the bottom of every indicator of well-being, then it's easy to tell them it's because you didn't work hard enough, and not to really acknowledge the fact that all of this has happened because Black folk have always been marginalized. There's never been a time in the history of this country that we haven't fought to get our rights and always dealt with the backlash. And this is just another case of that. This is a case of those that are in power not wanting to relinquish their power. And I think what is extremely chilling as well is that it's stretching into, as Leah mentioned, the LGBTQ community. It's stretching into transgender care. It's stretching into a women's right to choose. So all of these things really are creating what I feel like is more of a society where people don't have the ability to think for themselves. And if you don't have knowledge, then you don't have the ability to be a critical thinker. And then you really are able to just control, like has been said by the other panelists, you're able to really control the narrative and create the country that you want, because no one really has the knowledge to be able to say, hey, that's not right. So that's literally what we're seeing in front of our eyes, is really an initiative or initiatives to create the society that wants to, with every grip, just continue to hold on to control and make sure that those that are not in control are not educated about why, because then they will stay in the position where they are.
Most definitely. The next question is, and this is for anyone, is the Library of Congress, this is from Dana Marie, is the Library of Congress a guide for what can be in school and public libraries? Maybe that's a Joyce question or a Leah question.
I'm not positive how to answer that. One thing I would note is that the American Library Association has a committee. We have many committees, but there is a committee that works with the Library of Congress to make sure that our subject headings and the books that we're cataloging and the way that we're cataloging them are appropriate, are up to date. And I would say that group are tasked with being leaders for doing it right. and for holding those ethics strong. So in that way, I would say that the Library of Congress staff, along with library leaders in the country, are working to hold strong, do it right, and move forward. I don't know if that answered the question that the person had. And do either of you have additional comments?
I would say I'm not exactly certain about, I haven't studied the Library of Congress as extensively, I will be honest, but I think that our position, or what we have noticed, is that librarians are trained professionals who spend years researching, understanding library science. And so we want those decisions to be made at the library level. And I do think it's important to continue to think about community decisions impacting students to continue to be made at the community level by librarians in their community, because we want to make sure that they are reflective and responsive to the needs of the students in the community. And so I'm not certain whether or not it's a resource, but I would be reluctant to rely on it as an exclusive resource or an exclusive standard or what does and does not belong in schools, because just as race is being weaponized, we've seen any reference to sex or any reference to attraction within the LGBTQ community automatically being deemed to be pornographic, when it's not inherently pornographic, but that is because pornography is often a word that's used in the local librarian standards. That's something that people latch onto. So we do need people looking and considering critically whether or not a reference to, and I mean, one of the books that's under attack involves penguins, and a penguin has two dads. And this is like one of the most widely banned books. And so, I mean, there's so many books here too, but just thinking about having an external professional who can consider the context of the substance of what's being banned. And this is such a great graphic.
So all of this, that was a perfect segue into, I think, the final question. And it's certainly for everyone. I think the question, and it was a quote from James Baldwin that you shared earlier, Elizabeth, about to be African. Do you have that? Will you mind saying that quote again?
Oh, you know what? I
think
I said another quote. I think I just read it and I was like, oh, I love that quote too. It's like, to be African in America, to be African without the knowledge, and to be American without the rights or the privilege, something like that.
And so that leads me to the next question, where someone asked, there's many of us on here who are parents of Black children, educators of Black children, community servants of organizations with Black children and children of color. What can we do to instill a sense of Black joy in this learning, looking at all these books that are banned, that are inherently children books by largely Black authors? What can we do? I think you touched on it. You have an academy. Ms. Watson, I'm sure there's parents in all these communities where these students have built their coalition based on books that have been banned. What can we do to kind of instill that history and it not be in an underground railroad type deal that is what's happening now? Can anyone speak?
I think it's really important for us as parents to definitely empower ourselves and definitely to really build our own resilience so our children can understand just how important it is to know and understand their history. As I said, my parents were immigrants that did not know about Black history in the context of Black history in America. So I feel as though communities, whether it's nonprofit organizations, whether it's social organizations, whether it's fraternities or sororities, any community-based organizations really need to step up and provide those resources and really be a support for parents. I definitely feel the ability for Black children to see themselves in the world and to see themselves in literature is one of the most empowering things that can be done for a Black child in this country, especially because you see so much negativity. You don't see a lot of positive, media representation. There isn't already enough representation for Black children, even in the classroom. When you think about, across all these professional fields, a lot of times for myself in education, I even though being an educator, I went to predominantly Black schools, high school, middle school, and high school. Once I got to college, I went to University of Florida. And then after graduating and even just being very active on the LinkedIn platform, and this is also statistically proven, a lot of people have never even had a Black teacher. So it's really important that for our children, I think we continue to reinforce, whether it's bringing them to, fraternity, sorority events, bringing them to community organized events, getting them exposed to organizations like NAACP and ACLU and organizations that really advocate for Black Americans in society, just in general, so they understand exactly historically why these issues have occurred and what needs to be done in terms of their own empowerment. Like I said, for us, we also had teachers that were very proactive about bringing materials into the classroom. And that's really what inspired me to create Black History Culture Academy, because I really wanted to provide a resource. And there's so many resources that are available online. It's unfortunate that parents have to, at these, this time, really seek out resources. But as an eighth grade teacher, and others are teachers or maybe working in education can probably attest to that, there really isn't a great amount. I taught eighth grade American history, and it really wasn't a lot of information about the Black experience in America, and definitely nothing that was positive. I think when people said there was the McGraw-Hill book where they said Africans were migrants to America, I remember those textbooks because I was very young, just out of college when I started teaching American history. So a lot of this that we see even in what's available in the curriculum is not robust enough. A lot of this that we see in terms of ability or access to African American studies is not enough. So I really think it becomes incumbent upon us, because even before these challenges, there really hasn't been a robust offering of curriculum, of books, of resources within the K through 12 system, or even, you'll see more and obviously have more access to those in the library. But I really just feel it's important for children to be guided by somebody that can say, these are books that are important. These are books that I read. These are books that will help you to feel more positive about yourself. And I just don't know necessarily that the K through 12 system, as we see it today, is really doing that. So I definitely feel as though there has to be more of community-based efforts and really awareness like this and these types of programs, so that parents can empower themselves. I definitely feel as though other communities, being from South Florida, other communities do not rely on the K through 12 system to educate their children about their culture, because we see that in all throughout South Florida. We have a very vibrant Jewish community. We have a very vibrant Haitian Creole community. We have a very vibrant Caribbean community. We have a Cuban community, and none of that is really represented. There really isn't enough representation when it comes to the stories, this mosaic of all these different cultures, and where are children going to get that from. Unfortunately, we don't have a K through 12 system that is really responsive to the needs when it comes to all of these different racialized and ethnicities that need to know and have knowledge of self. So I always go back to this idea of, each one teach one, and this idea that we have to empower each other as legislation is being pushed through all these different states and at the federal level and at the Supreme Court level. We also have to be diligent in ensuring that we're showing our children what it means to be Black and the positive representation of Blackness. When I saw that picture, it just warms my heart to see that. And that's what children need to see. And if they're not seeing it in the classroom, then as parents, it becomes our responsibility, I think, to really ensure that our children have access to that as we fight these battles and as we create more dialogue and as we speak up about it. We also, we don't have time really to wait on the society to change, because it hasn't really been responsive to our needs really over the past couple 200-300 years. So I don't really have a lot of I don't really feel optimistic when it comes to the ability of the K through 12 system to be responsive enough to really create the environment that our children need. Our children need to know that they are brilliant, that they are excellent, that the sky is the limit, that anything that they think about, they can do. And I just don't see that that's happening in K through 12. And I definitely don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I really feel as though there has to be a sense of us as parents empowering ourselves and empowering our children, because our children are depending on us to do that.
It's in our interest, right? The storytelling.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to add very briefly, I completely agree with what Elizabeth said. I think one way to do that is starting at home. You don't have to have a full banned books club. I'm an aunt and obsessed with my niece and nephews, and we had a book club as she was transitioning in 7th grade, reading New Kid, to read and talk about it. It's also important for us to buy those books and support those authors. And then even extending beyond that, when I am a parent, I'm going to be giving as party favors, as birthday gifts, not only to Black kids, but to all kids. If your kid has white friends, the white friends need to see positive representations of Black children as well, and they need to read the same books as well. And if just making sure that that's another way of making ensuring that the people in your network are reading the same books. It doesn't have to be limited to Black kids. And I recognize there's a need for safe spaces, so the balance is necessary. But if there is an opportunity to bring in people who also won't receive this and also may not have parents who are thinking about this as intentionally, it is a way to make change too.
That's so good. The party favors and giving out books, I think that's something that is low-hanging fruit that anyone can do. Certainly. That brings us to our final thoughts. This has been a joy. And if you can all just go around, take about a minute or two to give your final thoughts, and something else in the chat, if you can include how can we counteract, or what can our counter be to these groups like Moms of Liberty that we find in our community that are going to these meetings and getting books banned and censoring and really opening the door to limited access to our students. It's a real thing in our county, albeit we're California. It's a real thing that's happening in North County, San Diego, much like Texas and Florida. Fortunately, the governor of California, Newsom, just signed a bill that will prevent people from banning books and curriculum. So that's a win for teachers and librarians and for students. So if you can give your final thoughts and how we can, just in general, and then include that, we certainly appreciate. We thank you for your time and all that you've contributed to this conversation. Anyone can go. Joyce, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Grassroots organizing, advocacy, sign up for Unite Against Book Bans and put in your zip code. So if something's going on in your area and the librarian or a teacher have asked for help, then Unite Against Book Bans can send out a blast saying, hey, we need you, to that zip code. Follow what Leah's doing, read what she's writing, join the ACLU initiatives. I'm looking forward to looking up Elizabeth's work. Again, there's no single way. There are so many outlets that it's important to just do your research and get on board, show up and organize and help other people organize with you.
I'm happy to jump in next so I don't follow Elizabeth again. So I agree with everything that Joyce said. I think one thing as we're parting, like this is a really pivotal moment for us to act right now and recognize that everything is on the line. I can't overemphasize that enough at the risk of sounding gloom and doom. At the same time, we are in a position where with ACLU, we have been having progress with litigation, but also recognizing that at the end of the day, if we win every single court case that we file holistically, which is always a challenge in these courts, the best we can get is the status quo that we already said was insufficient in 2020. And so thinking more broadly about what what our students actually deserve and what is at stake and what we need, that's not something we can craft through litigation. There will always be more work to do. I think that has to come not only from litigation and lawyers, but policy organizers, parents, literally everyone putting their voices together to say, at this moment, this is what we need. And thinking about entrenched groups like Moms for Liberty, these aren't insurmountable groups. They weren't even around 3 years ago. We have seen this sneak up right under our noses and we can stop it. But we have also seen that going from 0 to 700 challenges is something that has happened very quickly. Moms for Liberty has briefing books that say, this is how you go to the school board meetings. This is what you say. This is how you conduct a FOIA request so you can get information on the books. This is what you say. We can take those materials and use them for our purposes, but we have to have other voices in the room to outweigh. We know that they are a minority. The overwhelming number of Americans, both parents and non-parents, say that students should learn about the impacts of racism and the impacts of slavery at school at all levels. And so we have, the numbers are in our favor, but the time is not. And so we have to really find a way to come together, also recognizing that some of the groups that are working together don't typically work together. So we might have to do work internally. We need to see Black organizations partnering with LGBTQ organizations, and that might require some of our own work internally, but we have to come together because we're both under attack and we're going to lose by trying to just respond in a segmented way, which is part of their strategy. So I think it's just a time for people to come together, make their voices heard at every single level, call your legislators, call your school board, attend the meetings, and also just to make space for other ideas right now. I will also say support the ACLU, support the organizations that are doing this work. But if you do nothing else, one thing for free is that you can always use your voice, and that is the strongest tool you have. But certainly support our organizations as we're in these fights, because they are we're just at a very pivotal moment in this fight.
Well, with that said, thank you so much for, just this amazing in-depth conversation and all the resources and the tools. Please drop your contact information. We posted your websites, your contact information or any resources in the chat. Soror Bickham, do you want to give a closing or say thank you?
I definitely do.
Before she ends it, I want to personally thank everyone. Thank you to Soror Renee Tarver for just bringing me on to this. I'm gonna call it a ministry. Like this is God's work, for bringing me into this God's work and this social action event. And with that, I thank you, Elizabeth, Leah, and Joyce. You are phenomenal, brilliant women, and kudos. And I feel much better as an educator, an administrator, and a parent of Black boys with you and with you at the forefront of this and all the advocacy and the work that you're doing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, I will hand it back to Karen Bickham.
I just want to reiterate what Soror Kamilah said. This has been absolutely phenomenal. And I thank you personally, Elizabeth Leiba, Leah Watson, and Joyce McIntosh. Your information was so exceptional and so relevant, and just gave us so much thought and inspiration and conviction to get involved and do more, because it was just so incredible. And I thank you so much. But, I would also like to give an opportunity for our amazing social action chair, Renee Tarver, to give a few words also, because this was her brainchild. And so she came up with all of this. It was her vision. And so we're all parts of helping her to put it together, but she initiated all of this. So Renee, do you have any words, please?
So I just want to thank you
all. This was such an amazing thing to come together. I couldn't believe that you had time to do it. I am so glad that you had the interest to do it. And this is what Delta does. We are social action, and there's so much information that we had today that I just have to sit down and digest it all. But I thank you all for your time and your knowledge.